Friday. I might take another minute to go live actually because it there is like a lag between when I start the live and when Instagram lets me go live. So just stay with me. Yep. I think we are all set. Awesome. So, hi everyone. As I said, happy almost Friday. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am super excited to have even J Law join me in this conversation. Um, just a background about when I started and the reason I wanted to do this webinar with Manifest Law. Back in 2020, when I was going through my H1B process, the reason I got into considering EB1 was due to the unfortunate situation of my H1B not getting picked for 2 consecutive years. And I just had one last try left, and I wasn't sure what's the right thing to do. And that's when somebody in my office suggested to go with an O1 visa. And I started working on my O1 case. I had put together everything. And uh, by the time I had all my packet ready, thankfully, my third attempt of H1B did work out. So I had all of my content ready, and I was just thinking that, hey, like, what do I do with this? Like, what's something that I can do which will help me feel more secure in this country. And that's when I read about EB1 in one of the immigration portals, and I started working on my own case. I still remember back when I was doing this by myself, it just felt a lot lonely because there weren't a lot of information available online. And I wasn't sure when to like really start working with the lawyer because working with lawyers was expensive and I wasn't sure if I'm ready enough or not. So there were like a lot of question marks that I personally went through. And after I got my EB1 approved, I shared all of my experiences online on LinkedIn. I even did another like webinar around that time, and so many of you have messaged me that you have successfully gotten your EB1 after reading my post, after discovering EB1. So I'm just so glad that so many of you have had this success for yourself. And all I want to do is just spread the word more and have more people have an informed decision around going about EB1, for having you like help understand the difference between EB1 A, B, and C. A lot of times people don't even know that. So I wanted to work with somebody who's very renowned, who share really good resources. And Manifest Law is one of the best out there. I have been following Manifest for like quite some time. Their Instagram page is really resourceful. They're always on top of sharing any of the updates that come up, even during the time when there was a rule that passed saying that H1B requires 100K fee. They were the first to come out and share the news around, hey, what does this really mean, whom does this impact? And they're always there to demystify facts for you, so you don't feel triggered or you don't feel confused about the situation. And in today's webinar, I wanted to help all of you understand all about EB1, especially tech professionals. That's one of the things that a lot of people ask me about. So I'm super excited that I have Evan J. Law with me. He is one of the senior US immigration attorney. He has 17 years of experience, including 7 years where he was an appeals officer at USCIS. So he has a ton of experience in this space. He himself has reviewed EB1 petitions, so he has really good insights to share with you. So thanks a ton, even, to join us.
Sure. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you, and I'm just thrilled to hear of the journey that you took and that you're helping other people to take through this.
Amazing, and like kudos to your team. You guys have been sharing some really good resources out there, so it's always very helpful. I'm always like forwarding those to some of my other friends. So thank you so much for doing that. And
Wow, thanks.
just to start with, like you and I were discussing about this just before the call today, is how would you differentiate EB1A versus B versus C? Like it's sometimes very confusing for people in tech to figure out which one is the right fit for them.
Right. So basically, I would put those just on three tiers. You're looking. I mean, you can kind of compare them to gold medal, silver medal, bronze. I mean, in a way, for the Olympics. In and I say that because the EB1A is the top. It just requires you to show that you've risen to the very top of your field and that you have sustained a claim. We'll get into the specifics of it. That can sound very daunting, and one of the things we discussed before starting is that sometimes people may feel like, whoa, that's too much. I can't qualify for something like that. The EB1Bs, the next level down, so it's for outstanding researchers or professors, and you just have to meet less of the criteria. You don't have this daunting aspect of showing that you've risen to the very top of your field. And then the EB1C, that's compared to like an L1A visa. It's for multinational managers or executives that are basically coming over to fill that role, but full time and going towards a green card process. So the top two, the EB1A and EB1B, are the most subjective aspects of these, but EB1A really has this additional subjective component because you have this final merits determination, which is after you meet 3 out of these 10 requirements, the officer looks at, do you meet the overarching goals of the EB1A, which is showing you've risen to the top of the field with sustained acclaim. Yeah, they're multifaceted, but oftentimes researchers and professors, they will be able to get approved for an EB1A as well. So sometimes people might feel like it could be a stepping stone and they do EB1B first and then go for the EB1A. But if you feel like you're qualified, you might as well go all in on EB1A.
And uh, even is there any kind of like roles which is better qualified for EB1 in general, or like can anyone who's working in tech, whether they are like a program manager or if they are an engineer, or like do you have to have to be in a specific role to qualify for EB1, or is it like widespread?
No, it's widespread. The thing that I find is that with different positions and different career types, there's just a different type of case that you're presenting. And oftentimes I tell clients or prospective clients that this isn't a one size fits all,
Yeah,
um, way of going about this. So the way we'll prepare a case for a researcher will be different from someone else. But what you really want to do is have this overarching theme of what is it that demonstrates that I'm an expert in my field? What is it that will impress officers about my experience, my expertise? And basically that's what the officer is looking at, is how impressive is this person by what they've accomplished.
totally makes sense. And also, like, I saw this person posting this question on Instagram stream, which is something we will be discussing today around the EB1A final merit. So we will get to that question soon. But those of you who are streaming in with us, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop that in the comments. What I have done, like the questions that I had set up for even, is based on the frequently asked questions that people ask me, what I've seen people commenting on my earlier posts. So if you have something specific, if you think I've not covered that yet, please feel free to add that in the comments. I am actively looking at, if you see my eyeballs moving, that's because I'm like trying to look at the comments and see if you have any questions. So please feel free to add that in the comments and we will cover those questions. But moving on to the next part, right? Even like I got to learn about O1 because of this like H1B situation that I had, and um, it was thanks to one of my like lawyers at IBM who was proactively helping me with building up O1 case. But what would you say is the difference between doing O1 versus EB1? And would you recommend people to first go through O1 in order to get to EB1, or like what I did was directly do EB1? So what do you think is the pros and cons of doing O1 first versus directly doing EB1?
Yeah, it's a great question. And sometimes I have gone back and forth with clients on whether it's better to go all in on the O1 or the EB1. And so I'll probably give you both insights on kind of the pros and cons of both approaches. Um, what's interesting about this framework is that they're virtually identical in the requirements, and that's what's so odd about this. But when I was working for the government and adjudicating EB1s, there were just several comments I would hear from people from time to time where they would just say, "Oh yeah, but the O1, it's a different threshold," and I'd say, "I get that, but but the requirements are so similar." But the underlying gist is that the government feels like because EB1 leads to the green card, there's just a higher scrutiny given. There is probably one distinction I would say between the way the regulations are written that may be also part of this change, and this is probably going into the weeds too much. Maybe I'll just say this briefly, but for the EB1A, the regulations say it talks about the meeting the 3 out of the 10 requirements. They say this is initial evidence that you must submit, and so that kind of has given some people and maybe even with Kazarian, which is the case that laid out the EB1 framework, that might have had an impact as well, where in those in the legal world reviewing this are basically saying, okay, that was the initial requirements you have to meet, and then beyond that, we want to see, well, how does it look in the totality? It's I don't know. In some ways, well, there's a lot of opinions people have about Kazarian, but anyway, with the O1s, it's basically, it doesn't have that language, and so it's more apparent that if you just meet 3 out of the 10 requirements, you're set, you're good to go. And so as to your question about whether it's better to go for one or the other, in cases that are not as strong perhaps on the recognition part of this, and this goes to the final merits analysis, a lot of times people can meet 3 out of the 10 requirements but then have their case denied for an EB1A because the officer just feels like, well, there's just not enough recognition, there's not enough years of a claim, and so they can run into issues that way. And so sometimes if I recognize that may be an issue for someone, I may recommend an O1 as kind of a stepping stone. As they go for the O1, as they build that up, they are also preparing their acclaim, the recognition in the field, so that they'll have a stronger EB1 case going forward. Now, the flip side of that is you can also view this as almost like a stretch goal. If you stretch really far for like if you're close, you think you're really close to being able to meet the EB1A, you can stretch for it. That will also add to growth in your career. And then in the worst case scenario, if it's not approved, then you fall back on the O1 as well. So a lot of times that depends on how urgent it is for someone to get an I-140 approval, for example, or if they, their given situation kind of lends better to the EB1A. So it's really hard to decide one way or the other, because the other thing to keep in mind is just depending on the officer and the luck you draw, that has a lot to play into this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And like to your O1 point, I saw somebody sharing this question, which I think is really, really good. They're asking if O1, for applying for O1, do you need an employer all the time? So one of the cases, I used to think that you always need to have an employer in order to apply O1, but I do know of a few cases where people registered for their own company and then like applied mostly for like entrepreneurs. They have their company registered and they applied for their O1 from through their own company. Like correct me if I'm wrong, but like can you like shed some light on that?
Yeah, so that is an option that people can use with the O1, and definitely if you do that option, you really need an attorney to make sure that you handle that correctly, because you can do an O1 through either an employer or an agent filing the petition. So it can't be like a self petition straight away, but through the O1, you can even have multiple itineraries lined up, and it can be this option that you're discussing. So with that, there are some unique aspects with O1s as well, in that even O1Bs can open some unique opportunities there. But that's a conversation to have probably for another day. But um, basically, if somebody is close to meeting the threshold for an O1A, they might as well go for that. And in essence, that can give you basically what is like 3 years on an O1 as you're preparing to file for an EB1. That can really give you a good trajectory going forward.
No, yeah, I think that's a very good way to think about it, and especially like having those opportunities available for you. I feel like a lot of the issue comes from awareness perspective. Not a lot of people are aware of the different kind of criterias. I remember every single time that I speak with a friend and tell them that, hey, like if you are really worried about your immigration status, I would highly recommend for you to like check out EB1, whether it's A, B, or C. And their response typically is, oh, I'm not a researcher, or like, I've not published any papers, I've not presented at any conferences, so I don't think I'll qualify for it. So what would you recommend people who are in professions which might not be as externally visible, or do you think people have to be externally visible in order to qualify for EB1?
No, and that's the interesting part about this is that different case types for engineers or just a wide variety of tech positions, as long as the officers understand that they need to adjudicate it differently than they adjudicate a case for researchers,
Mhm.
then you should be in a good place. And that's something that as attorneys we try to remind them often. And there are even ways that you can provide documentation. For example, there's something called an insights report that will show what the citation level is for people in your given field at like the 90th percentile. And that can be a very useful thing to show because, engineers and people in other fields are not expected to publish like researchers do. But there's also a lot of other criteria that can help. There's one for leading or critical role. And this can be a lot of these criteria can be for things that even happened years ago. A high salary is one as well that you can use to basically show that you've risen to the top of your field. Judging is another one, reviewing the work of others. You need to make sure that it's not part of your job duties. And that's kind of an aspect of these cases as well, that oftentimes there are many aspects of these that there's internal components to them. For example, leading or critical role, that deals with what you've done internally for your organization, right? And so there's really not a lot of external aspects that come with that, but that's included in 3 out of the 10 criteria, which go towards a claim. High salary is the same thing. No one goes around talking about what their salary is, and so there's not really recognition there. But you basically view it as, well, the employer is recognizing me for my value, and so they're compensating me in this way. Um, Another thing that sometimes gets overlooked is, published material about you. If
Mhm.
people think, well, I'm never going to be published in like the New York Times or something, right? And um, that may be the case, but you may have an interview come out of a podcast or something that gets published in a professional journal or something like that. So the other thing is, um, these case types are evolving. When I was at the AAO, we started seeing a lot of documentation about people's successes on LinkedIn and social media. And at that time, the question was, well, wait a second, does this count as media
Yeah.
that we can rely on? And so some of these things are evolving. I generally say, as I come on webinars and things, USCIS has become much more reasonable over the past few years in a number of the ways that they adjudicate these case types. So, it's kind of dense reading, but you can go online, uscis.gov, and just do a search for extraordinary ability. You'll pull up the policy manual, and you can read about a lot of the details about how you can meet different aspects of the criteria. You can do the same thing for outstanding professors or researchers. Yeah. So anyway, I was going on and on.
No, no,
Uh,
no. It's pretty helpful. I feel like we've spoken a lot about the different criterias, and I'm seeing some people like put this on the chat that, hey, which three criterias are easier to get, or which one would you recommend for people to like pursue first? So I love the slide that you had put together, which very comprehensively explains the 10 criteria. So if you can, like maybe we can pull that up and we can
sure.
talk through the criterias real quick.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll pull those up. So that's a great question, and this is a kind of a double-edged sword here with the question because in one way there can you see the screen? Did it come up?
Just give me 1 second. I think I have to turn it on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges with that question is that um, if you look at the three easiest criteria to meet, well, that will help you obviously to meet the criteria and then get to the final merit stage. But that can also hurt you in, be, because then the officer is saying, okay, well, now we're looking at these aspects, and now we're looking at it. How impressive is that, right? And so if it was something easy for you to accomplish, there's a good likelihood that it's just not as impressive. So, if I were to pick some of the ones that I feel like are kind of the lower level ones, judging is one. Officers kind of have a lower view on that. Membership as well can be one like that, and sometimes awards can be that way. And in part, that's also just coming from my background. And after you review so many of these, it's almost like you become callous to the. You've just seen things over and over again that you really stop being impressed by them as much. But as I've been now in private practice, and I recognize a few things that I didn't as an adjudicator. For example, with judging, the one that I was holding out as the lowest level, now I recognize, wait a second, when someone is asked to judge the work of others, that it's really a characterization that this person is at the top of their field. They have this expertise to be able to judge the quality of someone else's work. So that's one that, for example, in the final merits, that's what I usually try to point out is this goes towards showing that you've risen to the top of your field. Now, you also want to look at, well, what are the types of judging that you are doing? If you're asked to review journals and the journal that you're reviewing for is just not as prestigious, well, that can hurt you in the final merits analysis. So it's hard to say which of these are the easiest to meet, because I don't know also how difficult it is to write a scholarly article. That seems very time consuming. I've written a couple of novels, but I could just make up things, right? Um, with the original contributions, I would say that's probably the hardest one to meet. And oftentimes I suggest people don't try to claim that unless it's really strong. And as you look at this number 6, this is evidence of original work, has major significance in the field. USCIS wants to see that it's had a wide impact in the field, and that's why it's very difficult to meet. But anyway, that's what I would say about those. And then just depending on your salary, that can be an easy one to meet if you have a high salary, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but then again, it's difficult to show that comparison. We will go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have some comparisons there. You want to show that you're in the top 10% for your position. So those are a few thoughts, and we can take other questions from there.
Yeah, I think this is super helpful. And one of the other kind of follow-ups to what you just were talking about, right? Like whether it's judging, whether it's original contributions, whether it's media, what ends up happening is a lot of the professionals are um, organically very tuned into their 9 to 5. and they have not done any of the external work, as you might think, right? Like whether it's judging competitions or uh, going for like conference speaking, or like even bothering to figure out how they can get a media coverage and stuff. So what would you recommend? Like I feel like to some extent there are certain roles in tech which is uh, hyped to some extent, like which is really widely spoken about, whether it's AI or whether it's data science, whether it's software engineering. It's very widespread to some extent. But I would say there are some roles which is, say, around like quality assurance, like QA testing stuff in tech, or whether it's product management in tech. Product managers are not really building code, they are not publishing any of their work, but most of their work is strategic. Same is the case with, let's say, consultants, right? Like a lot of their work is pure strategy, and they're not really producing any hardcore code per se. So people who have not been like tuned out of their 9 to 5, who've been like heads down on their 9 to 5, who've not thought about doing anything outside of work, and people who are especially in strategy kind of roles, what would you recommend? Like, where do they start building up those hard evidences?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would suggest is kind of start with the very beginning of this, which is you need to start believing in yourself that you are an expert in your field with a lot to offer, right? And so one of the first ones I would start with is look at the leading or critical role. The leading role is this more supervisory type of a role where if you are in a position of management or leadership in general, that can qualify for that criterion. With critical role, you want to be looking at, okay, what are the things that I can be doing to really further the objectives of my business? And in a way, I mean, the business world is built for this because of every year we're trying to go to our employer and say, look, this is what I've done over the past year. Let's talk about my compensation and how we think we can move forward in our relationship together, right? The incentive is always to be improving and making progress. And so as you look at these things, what I would suggest is take a twofold approach. One, you want to be doing whatever you can to further the objectives of your organization for that either leading or critical role, which can also hopefully lead toward a higher salary. If you do those two things, you've already met two out of the criteria that you need. And then I would say, what can you do to be networking with others in your field?
Mm.
And even if that's going to lunch with a colleague or someone that you know that has some other expertise that you have maybe dabbled in with something with um, AI or something that's up and coming in the industry, you never know where these things are going to lead. And so that's why oftentimes I talk to people about networking as they build up their portfolio, because those opportunities can come organically. And that's how we want them to come. We want people to reach out to them and say, hey, I saw your post on LinkedIn. I'm giving a presentation um, to whoever it is, fourth graders, right? And then you move up to college students or whatever. I mean, it's one of those things that you can't really just say, if I do this and this and this, I will make sure that I'm going to get approved for this. But basically, as you have the mindset of growth and basically having more visibility for who you are, that can help in a lot of ways. And it certainly helps you obtain a lot better letters of recommendation when people can write about the things they've admired in you and your career growth.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And one other like interesting question that I'm seeing in the chat, which I think is also like very valid, is can you only apply for EB1 once? Let's say somebody applies for it and they get rejected. Can they apply again?
Yeah, they can apply again, and I recommend that you apply again, especially because what that shows is your dedication, your persistence. I mean, it takes a lot out of you to do this. It's a very big step, but what I would suggest though is that each time you apply again, for example, let's say you apply, you feel like you got an officer who's very strict minded, didn't really go through your evidence, and so if your case is denied, then you decide, well, I'm just going to refile maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. Hopefully, I get a different officer. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Because the other petitions are there, and what you really want to demonstrate is, okay, what additional growth have you had, or how are you strategically positioning your case that it wasn't presented that way before? So I guess I'll take that back in a way to say, well, if your strategy wasn't aligned well enough, then you could take that approach. But generally speaking, there are two things to think about this. One is that it can leave an impression on an officer, almost like a first impression, when they look in the file and they see, oh, this person has been denied before. Well, sometimes that does stick with you as an officer, um, but that can be a slight hurdle to overcome. But um, certainly people have had their cases denied and then approved later on. So it really depends. I know a lot of times people want to avoid having a denial, and oftentimes I do encourage people to try to avoid that. But there's just a fine balance between the approaches, because there is so much subjectivity here, that a lot really just does depend on who the officer is that gets the case. And sometimes I would just say this, for people who have had their cases denied, there were times that I read through a prior denial and I just thought, wow, that officer was just really strict. I can't believe that they denied this case. And so in that way, then it wouldn't hurt you, applying again, as as long as you have a different officer adjudicating it, though. So, and I'm not trying to say I was the best one there. I tried to be reasonable and do my best, and I think there are still really good officers there, but we are in a kind of a challenging time immigration wise. So,
Totally makes sense. And I think there is like one thing that you did mention early on, which is about the two-step Kazarian approach. I believe I saw a news article which said that that's been removed. So now there is no criteria for totality of the case. But just wanted to hear it from you. Like, what's your perspective? What's going on?
yeah, so I'll just piggyback off of what you said earlier, that you were appreciative that Manifest puts things out so quickly. Well, so I was so thrilled yesterday because I thought I was the first one to get this breaking news about this case that came out. And so I sent this message to 3 attorneys, and then later, about 2 hours later, I realized people had been talking about that internally for about 4 or 5 hours, and I was way behind on that. So I'll give you just a brief overview of this and what it might mean. So there was a case that was just decided yesterday, from Nebraska, where a federal court in Nebraska approved someone's EB1A case, and basically held that the Kazarian second step approach, with this final merits approach that we're talking about, that that requirement was invalid, and that the government should have introduced that step through what we call notice and comment rulemaking, which is a process where you get comments from the public, and then the government takes them into account and then publishes a rule. That's how regulations are formed. So anyway, the government tried doing this years ago, and they ended up abandoning the approach. And so the issue in this case went right to the heart of that process. And so it's not to say, so there's probably a lot to say about this as far as the legal ramifications, but what this means. So let me just say this generally. So the Kazarian case came out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and so that's binding on that area, which is California and a few other states. And in Nebraska, that's under the Eighth Circuit, and so that's like a trial court lower level court. So it's not binding like a circuit court is. Um, and so what we're basically explaining to people is that, this doesn't have anything binding on USCIS to say that, that the final merits is now abolished or anything like that. But what this does is it provides some better reasoning that attorneys can use for cases where someone does get to the final merits analysis. Now this is something that we can utilize to say, listen, you need to make sure that you're not just giving a vague response of, oh, you haven't shown that you have sustained a claim, but that you need to put specific reasons for why they're denying it in that level. So we will continue to see how this plays out over time, but in essence, um, this is interesting. I mean, when I transitioned from working for the government to going into private practice, one of the thoughts I had was maybe one of these days I'll bring a lawsuit against Kazarian, right? And so, but here these other attorneys have done that. So hopefully that makes sense. There are some complexities here that we'll have to see how they play out, but that's kind of the overview.
No, I think this is super helpful. Like, thank you for laying out the entire process and like everything that happened from the context of it. I had like one more question, but I'll probably like also let people know that we had limited time today, so we went through all of the frequently asked questions, but I know a lot of you might have very specific questions to your case, and it's not something that you might want to share in a public forum like this, or you might have like need more time to speak with an attorney for a deep dive. So I've shared a link on the chat. I'll also like drop it in separately in the post. But what you can do is you can fill out the quiz. There'll be a small quiz that pops up. And once you fill out the quiz based on the answers that you've submitted, there'll be certain people who are eligible for a free lawyer consultation from Manifest. And you can like ask all of your questions to the lawyer, and you can like share all of your case specifications, your background, everything, and ask for specific answers from them. So that'll be like helpful than like going through all of your personal questions in a public forum. um, Now coming back to the final question that I had, which is a very very important question which a lot of people have asked me, which is like, when am I ready? Like, how do I do a self assessment? How do I know if I'm ready? What's the homework to some extent that I need to do? Like, what's the documentation that I need to put together before I go like speak with a lawyer? So what would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would suggest is, go to the USCI's website, like I said, and look at the details in the policy manual if you're fine with that, or even just do a Google search of the 10 criteria.
Mhm.
Write down the 3 to 4 to 5 or so that you think you meet, and generally, if you feel like you meet two of them and then have a third that's questionable, that's a good indication that now's a good time to speak with an attorney about it. But if as you're going through it, you're looking at this and saying, "Wow, I don't even know that, I can see one that I get to," then what I would suggest is just try reading up on the requirements and try to build up the um, your background and your experience so that you can at least have two or three. As far as documentation that I would provide, what I would start doing is basically looking at this, almost setting aside the requirements for a moment. You want to look at both, but almost take a moment and think to yourself, what are the things that I've done in my career that show that I'm an expert in my field? What are the positive things people have said about me? What are, go back over your performance reviews, things like that. Look at what level of salary you're at. You can start comparing that online, if to others in your field and that kind of a thing. But basically, you want to just have a good understanding of why you have just this confidence that you are an expert in your field. And then from there, start looking at, okay, now how can I match up these things with these criteria? Sometimes people might forget some of the things that they've done, maybe awards that they've won internally. So you might look at the awards category and it says, okay, nationally or internationally recognized awards. So that won't help you meet that criterion, but could those awards go towards showing that you've performed a leading or critical role for your employer, right? And so what I would suggest is just recognize that there are different ways to meet these requirements. For example, sometimes people have authored chapters of books, right? It doesn't fit right aligned well with the scholarly articles, but there may be a way you can use what is in the last part of the regulations. You know, after the 10 are listed, it talks about comparable evidence, and so that may be something that you could consider. But in essence, what you want to do is kind of just line up as much evidence as you can to have talking points about these things. Have you ever been interviewed on a podcast? You know, you might look at that and say, well, that doesn't really fit with the, published material about me. It's not major media. But that gives an indication of your recognition in the field. Maybe the topics that you've discussed would be um, very impressive for an officer to look at. And maybe that leads to a discussion of, okay, have you ever been invited to present anywhere? Well, presentations aren't part of the criteria, but that goes towards the final merits analysis. And so recently I published something on LinkedIn where I talked about portfolio building as well as portfolio digging. And what I mean by digging is sometimes we just forget what we've done in our past. And so if you can go back to old emails and just dig through what are the things that I've done, what are the accolades that I have from years ago that I could point to, that might be also helpful as well.
I think that was super helpful and gives a mental model of how you should be getting started with your own case. Thank you so much, Evan, for sharing all of this. I have again like shared the link to start your quiz, and that'll help you book some time with one of the lawyers at Manifest. They are really, really well informed, and I believe like they're super supportive with the applications and working with you to get your petition out. So yeah, I've shared that out with people. If you have any questions, feel free to actually like drop that in the comment. I'm sure a lot of you might be watching this later on when we are not live anymore. But Manifest team and I will be keeping an eye out on the comments even after the live session. So highly recommend people to put their questions in. The link to the survey is out there on the comments. And yeah, I think that sort of summarizes everything that we wanted to chat about today.
Sounds great. Well, thanks for having me on. It's nice to chat about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Evan, for joining us.
Sure.
Have a good one, everyone.